In the first scene, a woman named Chase wakes up on an unknown island with a shell in her hand. She doesn't remember anything, including her identity, and is puzzled how she ended up there. Shortly after, we get to know that there are 9 other people stranded on the island with her. All of them are dressed in similar clothes and have no recollection of who they are. Chase first meets a woman named Casey, who reveals that she woke up with a knife. Confused with whatever is happening, Casey threatens to fight, but Chase calms her down and takes the knife away from her. Next, everyone on the island gathers in one place and tries to recall who they are. Eventually, they find their names on the neck labels of their shirts. The group then tries to figure out how they ended up on the island. One of them rules out a plane crash or a ship incident, as all of them are in perfectly good condition. Everyone having amnesia at the same time is also impossible. Maybe they all boarded the same Disney cruise. You can't trust Mickey in 2022. After failing to find an answer, Chase goes around the island in search of clues. She is joined by the macho of the group, Brody, and a talkative guy, Donovan. The trio ends up finding different survival items, including a first aid kit buried under the spot where everyone was lying. Chase and Brody then decide to search for food and fresh water, while Donovan returns to the others to light a fire. After walking for hours through the jungle, Brody and Chase come across a freshwater source, a beautiful waterfall. In the heat of the moment, they also make out. Seconds later, Chase decides that the romance is enough for one day, but Brody craves more and tries to assert himself on her. Enraged, Chase pulls out her knife and threatens to stab him before running away. Elsewhere, Donovan and the others go for a swim in the sea, where they are soon surrounded by sharks. Everyone panics and rushes to the shore, but poor Donovan is bitten and taken away. After a while, Chase and Brody separately arrive at the camp. She accuses him of having bad intentions, but Brody denies the allegation. Before things could escalate, 2 sensible guys, Cooper and Moses, separate them. Like the Red Sea. They then reveal that a shark killed one of their friends. At night, everyone takes a nap, and Chase has a nightmare where she pulls a gun on an elderly woman. Soon, she wakes up in a cold sweat and decides to go for a walk. I gotta stop dreaming about beating up old people. A few meters ahead, she surprisingly comes across a badly wounded but alive Donovan. She immediately alerts everyone, and they carry him back to the camp. There is a trained nurse in the group named Blair, and she starts taking care of Donovan. Later, Brody suggests moving inland to find a better shelter, but Chase and the others feel that they should try and find a way out of the island. As everyone is discussing, the youngest members of the group, Mason and Hayden, reveal that they noticed a pattern earlier. It turns out that each of them were located exactly 39 steps away from one another when they first woke up on the island. On multiplying 39 with the number of people present on the island, i.e. 10, they walked 390 steps and found a signboard that says, "Find your way back." However, the others think that it's a nothing burger, more insane than Hurley's lottery numbers, they say, and return back to the camp. This frustrates Chase, and she smashes her shell in anger. Surprisingly, there is a digital key hidden inside it, which she doesn't notice. The next morning, Chase wakes up earlier than everyone and shockingly notices a tent boat in the sea. She immediately swims towards it, barely escaping the sharks. Inside, she finds multiple suitcases and a backpack with some bullets and a bunch of other items which reference the number 39. An elated Chase then paddles the tent back to shore and hides it. She also hides the suitcases separately, and it's revealed that one of them contains medicine while the other has a locked box. After a while, she joins the others at the camp and watches Casey leave with Brody in search of food. Once deep in the jungle, the two flirt and start making out. Later, they return to the camp and notice a massive storm approaching from the distance. Brody again insists on moving inland, and this leads to a physical altercation between him and Cooper. At last, when the group refuses to follow his orders, Brody leaves for the forest alone. In no time, the storm arrives, and Chase is forced to tell everyone about the tent, where they eventually spend the night. The next morning, after the skies clear, Chase ventures out and finally notices the digital key. She rushes to open the suitcase and finds a revolver inside. Later, the young girl Hayden notices a contrasting change in Casey's demeanor. After she went into the forest with Brody, she presses her for information, and Casey finally reveals that Brody mistreated her. Meanwhile, Chase and Cooper hike up a mountain to get a better look at the island. To their surprise, they come across a huge abandoned hotel with a functional freshwater fountain. Afterwards, they return to the camp, and she takes a shot at Brody again, which leads to another altercation. Fed up with all the torture, Brody decides to stay on his own. That night, Chase again dreams of pulling a gun on the same old woman from earlier. The next morning, everyone wakes up to Brody's dead body. He was killed by the same knife Chase had been carrying around. So, expectedly, they blame her for the murder, despite her best efforts to claim that she is innocent. When nothing works, Chase starts fighting back. It's clear that she is a trained fighter, but Cooper and the others eventually outnumber her and knock her unconscious. In the next scene, Chase wakes up to find herself in a room with a nurse. This naturally puzzles her, and she demands answers, but the nurse sedates her instead. Next, Chase wakes up in another room with a doctor beside her. He reveals that she is actually a prisoner and that they are in a futuristic Texas correctional facility. Chase is then escorted to the prison warden, Mr. Wells' office. Confused and angry, she demands to know why she is in prison and why she was on an island before. Wells doesn't mention the reason for her incarceration, but reveals that the island is actually a computer simulation called I-Land. Whoa, that's clever. The 9 other people there are also imprisoned criminals. Wells further explains that the island is designed to test the criminals and change them for the better through the use of harsh techniques. Anyone who dies in the simulation dies in real life. How does that help anyone? This confuses Chase even more, and she assumes that everything is a lie. But Wells tells her that she can find out for herself when she is sent back to the simulation shortly. Later, she is presented before the members of the Rehabilitation Advisory Board. They again brief her that the program's aim is to give prisoners a second chance at life and see if they repeat their past behavioral patterns, unless they get bitten by a simulated shark and die. One of the advisory members feels that Chase has failed and she shouldn't be sent back to I-Land because of her self-serving and violent nature. At the halftime break, Wells confides in Chase that although he is in charge of conducting this rehabilitation program, he doesn't approve of it. He feels that it's a total waste of money trying to rehabilitate people who frankly don't deserve it. For instance, Brody is incarcerated for forcing himself onto others, but even inside, the rehabilitation program couldn't change him. Wells further reveals that the program is designed to kill anyone who kills others. He also confirms that Chase did in fact not kill Brody, and it was someone else. Before departing, Chase inquires about a recurring dream where she is pulling a gun on an older woman. Wells simply replies that it's a memory from her real life. Later, the advisory members take a secret vote and decide to send Chase back into the program. Before the preparations for it begin, one of the advisory members, Dr. Weiss, privately meets Chase and warns her that the warden is secretly manipulating the results of the simulation. She can't prove how, but she is sure of it. On her way to the doctor's room, Chase manages to escape and reaches the simulation room disguised as a worker. There, she witnesses the chamber where Cooper and the other prisoners have been kept in cryosleep. However, before Chase can investigate more, she is caught, and Warden Wells again sends her back into I-Land. Next, Chase wakes up inside the simulation, tied up by her fellow Islanders, who believe that she murdered Brody. She insists that she's innocent, and also tries to explain that they are actually inside a computer simulation. Chase further reveals that they are all incarcerated criminals, who have been sent off to this island to prove that they can change. No one believes her, but Cooper admits having a vague memory of talking to a warden who wears a cowboy hat. Suddenly, the young girl, Hayden, has a flashback and remembers the time that got her incarcerated. It turns out she brutally killed her husband, who she suspected of cheating on her. Meanwhile, Chase continues to insist that she's innocent, and even accuses one of them of killing Brody. This infuriates the others, and they call her a serial liar, accusing her of hiding things ever since they got to this island. As the group continues bickering, suddenly, 2 new Islanders show up. They introduce themselves as Bonnie and Clyde, and claim that they woke up on the other side of the island in an abandoned village. However, when Chase finds their accents strikingly similar to the warden's, she suspects that they have been sent to manipulate the group. As Cooper grills the new Islanders, the outspoken brat of the group, Taylor, remembers that Bonnie and Clyde are actually the names of a famous bank robber couple from the 1930s. Then, Chase points out that oddly, these two haven't said anything about the dead body of Brody, which any normal person would be horrified after seeing. With this, Bonnie and Clyde realize that they have blown their cover. That was quick. And finally admit that they are police marshals, much to everyone's shock. The very next second, Clyde approaches Hayden, stabs her with a knife, and reveals that it was her who killed Brody. It turns out that Hayden committed the murder as she was scared of becoming Brody's next victim. Meanwhile, Clyde explains that before the prisoners entered this program, they signed waivers agreeing to the rules of the program. Now, if they die inside the simulation, they will die in real life. Moreover, if they kill someone inside the simulation, they will be killed in return. Clyde then reveals that they altered everyone's cerebrum, so the prisoners will slowly regain their memories, including why they got incarcerated. He warns them that once they regain their memories, they might want to kill one another for the horrible things they have done in real life. Clyde then turns everyone against Chase, saying she is hiding medical supplies and other items. The plan works, and everyone becomes enraged, so Chase is forced to leave. Before she departs, she hands over the medicine to the group to prove that she's not a bad guy. However, she does not mention the revolver and takes that with her. After a while, the second good guy of the group, Moses, demands to know how and when this is all going to end. Clyde responds that it will end when they reach the other island. However, for that, they will need his approval. Before leaving, he also makes it clear that if any of them tries to exit the simulation prematurely, he and Bonnie will hunt them down. By this point, I'm failing to see the point of this simulation at all. After burying the deceased bodies, Casey, Cooper, and Moses decide to go to the opposite side of the island in search of food and shelter, while the others decide to stay back in the camp with Donovan, who is still recovering from the shark bites. Donovan thanks the nurse Blair for her efforts, and it becomes clear that he has feelings for her. Meanwhile, after hours of traveling, Casey and her group locate a village where they come across several empty huts. Casey and Moses lay down to rest while Cooper decides to go looking for Chase. Suddenly, Casey starts to regain her memories and sees herself in a car driving into the ocean. Back at the camp, the young guy Mason also starts remembering his past. He sees himself storming into a supermarket with a rifle and gunning everyone down in sight. This finally reveals that Mason is a deadly mass shooter. Similarly, Blair also sees her past, which reveals that she was a nurse at an old age hospital. It turns out she was incarcerated for killing many of her elderly patients by injecting potassium chloride into their IV bags. In her defense, Blair claimed that she only killed the patients who requested her to put them out of their misery. Elsewhere, Chase arrives at the abandoned hotel from earlier and starts having flashbacks from her past. This time, she learns that the old lady in her dreams is actually her own mother. The visions terrify Chase, but she manages to calm herself down and soon finds a key to room 39. She scans the entire room and locates an envelope hidden behind a painting. Inside, she finds a picture of a farm and a picture of herself with her mother. She also finds a picture of Cooper and her. This shockingly reveals that the two are a couple from real life. The show then flashes back to Casey's past. She works at a diner and is married with 2 children. However, her husband often punishes her for no reason. One day, she meets a handsome man and falls in love with him. The two start meeting regularly and their bond deepens. So, Casey gathers all her courage and reveals everything to her husband. She also demands a divorce, but the cunning husband threatens to take their children away. Because of this, Casey loses hope for life and decides to end it all. At first, she drowns her children in the sea and then returns home and commits the unthinkable in front of her abusive husband. Similarly, it is revealed that Moses was a far-right activist who blew up a gas pipeline to bring awareness to the several injustices going on in the world. However, the plan went horribly wrong, and it ended up killing 8 innocent students who were on an engineering tour. In the present, Moses notices a distraught Casey and comforts her, saying they have to forget the past and move on with their lives. Casey obliges, and together, they decide to look for Chase in hopes of getting out of this simulation. On the other hand, as Cooper is wandering around the forest alone, he notices Bonnie and Clyde passing nearby. He eavesdrops on their conversation and learns that the two are working for an unidentified person without the knowledge of the Rehabilitation Advisory Board. This means that someone has secretly hired Bonnie and Clyde to sabotage the rehabilitation program by turning everyone against one another. Elsewhere, the spoiled brat Taylor has had enough and decides to leave the island alone. Blair tries to stop her, but Taylor aggressively gets into the tent boat and sails away. After a few hours, she reaches another island where she comes across human skulls. She also starts regaining her memories, and it turns out she robbed a bank with her boyfriend. Taylor soon falls asleep, and when she wakes up, she finds her right hand wrapped with a bandage. She also finds some soup that someone apparently cooked for her. Shortly after, Bonnie and Clyde show up and tell Taylor that she shouldn't have come to this island, as a cannibal lives here. After they leave, Taylor quickly opens her bandage and freaks out. It turns out the cannibal fed her a soup of her own fingers. Elsewhere, Donovan also recalls his past, and it's revealed that he's a dangerously obsessive man who killed his former coworker after she rejected him. Back in the simulation, he abruptly proposes to Blair, much to her shock. She's at a loss for words and doesn't respond to the proposal. The same day, Mason hurts himself and Blair nurses his wounds. This obviously makes Donovan jealous, so he tries to get her attention by pretending that a bug got into his eyes. And when they are alone, he attempts to turn her against Mason. However, this only creeps Blair out, and she leaves abruptly. Later, when no one is looking, the overly possessed Donovan attacks Mason and strangles him to death. He then hides the corpse with some leaves. Meanwhile, Blair recalls the rest of her memory. It turns out she is a lesbian who is married to a woman. Elated, she rushes to share the news with Donovan, but when she notices Mason's corpse, she pretends to be into him so as not to anger the deranged man. However, at an opportune moment, she covertly gets hold of Mason's flare gun and shoots Donovan dead. Meanwhile, Cooper reunites with Chase, and the two start reminiscing about their past together. The scene then flashes back to Chase's childhood. It's revealed that her mother, Mrs. Chase, was a horrible woman who always berated her for being weak. In hopes of pleasing her, Chase secretly joined kickboxing to make herself stronger. However, Mrs. Chase still put her down for developing manly arms. Wait until Mrs. Chase plays The Last of Us 2. Fed up, Chase finally takes a stand and joins the Marines. There, she meets Cooper, and they develop a relationship. Unfortunately, during a mission, Cooper is injured while trying to save her and is forced to retire from the army. The injury leaves Cooper horribly scarred, but Chase assures him that they will earn their living on her mother's ranch. In the next scene, Moses and Casey also show up at the abandoned hotel and demand to know more answers from Chase. This infuriates Cooper, as he has had enough of everyone treating her terribly. In the heat of the moment, he pulls out Chase's revolver and points it at Casey. Suddenly, he gets a vision where he sees himself trying to convince Mrs. Chase to let them use her ranch. However, as always, the arrogant woman berates her daughter for marrying a man like Cooper. One thing leads to another and the two get into an argument. In an effort to ward him off, Mrs. Chase pulls out a gun, but Cooper tussles with her and accidentally gets her shot. Back in the simulation, when Cooper snaps out of his vision, he realizes that he has just shot Moses. In utter disbelief, he then admits to Chase that it was him who shot her mother. This means that Cooper is not a saint after all. First he killed someone, then he framed Chase along with himself, hoping to get away with a lighter sentence. Right then, Bonnie and Clyde show up and decide to punish him for killing Moses, but Chase takes his side and a long battle ensues. In the process, Bonnie is killed, while Chase is impaled through the stomach by Clyde. However, before he could attack the others, he is pulled out of the simulation along with Bonnie's body. Chase is also pulled out before she bleeds to death. Later, she wakes up in the medical room where the board member, Dr. Weiss, tells her that she's been exonerated of all of her crimes because of Cooper's confession. It turns out the surveillance team noticed the rogue marshals just in time and pulled them out. Chase is relieved, and she explains that Warden Wells is behind all of this. Dr. Weiss admits that she is aware of this, but says that they need hard evidence to nail him. Chase then goes through a series of tests and interviews, from which she learns that all the inmates inside the island were actually on death row. They voluntarily decided to go to the island because it was the only way they could possibly get a shot at redemption. Meanwhile, the corrupt Wells senses his impending doom, so he arranges a meeting with Chase. He reveals that her late mother hasn't left a penny for her, so when she walks out of the prison, she has nothing to her name. Wells then offers to help her if she doesn't accuse him of anything in front of the jury. He also warns her that if she tries to cross him, he will make her life hell. Knowing that Chase is a woman of principle, Wells tells her that he tried to sabotage the program because everyone inside the island are terrible human beings and they deserve the death row. Chase agrees to help, but she puts forth a condition. Cooper also needs to be released so that she can deal with him herself. Surprisingly, Wells agrees, and Chase is presented before the jury. During the trial, a jury member reveals that 39 is the number of steps from the end of the cell block to the electric chair. This appalls Chase, and she calls the whole experiment sadistic. As the conversation starts getting intense, Wells begins to panic and immediately announces a 30-minute break. Realizing that she won't keep up her end of the deal, he corners Chase in the medical room and proceeds to poison her. Fortunately, Dr. Weiss arrives in the nick of time and catches him red-handed. After being apprehended, Wells is presented before the jury for an interview. This time, he finally admits to manipulating the simulation, including placing a cannibal on the island. He then lashes out at the jury and warns Chase about the truth. Later, Dr. Weiss injects something into Chase and asks her to look into the mirror. Lo and behold, she looks 25 years older, and that is the real Chase. Here, we get to know that it has been 25 years since she was incarcerated and sent to the island. Her younger self was just an avatar they used to confuse her. Hearing everything, Chase feels wronged and demands justice. However, Dr. Weiss consoles her and escorts her out of the prison. Outside, Chase notices palm trees, which puzzles her as they are in Houston, which never had beaches. Dr. Weiss explains that as the politicians tried to deny climate change, sea level continued to rise, and now Houston is surrounded by water. As the sea started claiming more and more land. People lost their jobs and their homes. Ultimately, they turned to crime, and the rehabilitation program was born. Here, prisoners are given a chance to find their way back to society. In the final scene, Chase leaves the facility and walks towards the dilapidated Houston, while Casey and Cooper welcome Warden Wells to Island.